ready?
Yep.
Hi, I'm Catherine. Welcome to One Stitch in the Veil. We have been waiting to make this video for a long time. This is my husband, Lance. He's taking time out of his workday to be able to share with you his perspective on the story and what we went through in our marriage and why we left church and how we got into the Hebrew Roots movement. So if you haven't seen any of my videos before, I had walked through deception a few years ago in what I call the Hebrew Roots movement, and you can see more details of my personal story on R.L. Solberg's channel, Defending the Biblical Roots of Christianity. I'll post a link here to that interview, as well as a link is in the community section. So if you go to community on One Stitch in the Veil, you'll see a link to that video there, and you can get some backstory to that. And other videos I've made as well are specifically to help those who have been through deception and who have come out of it. Oftentimes it leaves us alone. We don't have someone to turn to, and so that you can reach out and comment that you've been through it too. We can chat, as well as families who have people who are in the Hebrew Roots movement currently and maybe dealing with some tough situations there. I talk about what Hebrew Roots is, and just some things and ways that we can get through some of those hard times with our friends and family. Okay, so we're just going to have a conversation. We have had a lot of conversations over the past couple years about everything we walked through and things we learned from it, what we're going through now. And so we're just going to sit and talk like we do at home, and you can be a fly on our wall. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm her husband, Lance.
We've been married for 19 years.
Yeah, almost 20.
Yeah, it'll be 20 in December. And we've been together for about 21 or so.
At least.
So this is my person. And thankfully, everything we walked through, I think it made our marriage stronger. Some of you are walking through some hard times in marriage, and we are going to be very, very sensitive to that. So we're in a situation where I don't feel that we had some of the deep struggles that I hear that some of you all have had, but we definitely had some issues and times, and we're just going to talk about how we dealt with it, what it was like. How did Lance love me through it? He himself did not turn to Hebrew Roots or believe in those things. I did, and so we're just going to work through some of those things. All right. So we have been involved in a church forever. I mean, just since I was raised in a church, you were raised in a church, you were raised going to church on a regular basis, where I was not. But even at the point where we met in college in 1999, we were plugged into a church. We even met through some church leadership programs, and we were in the same church for many years, and then we switched to another church for a few years. And so we're going to talk about some of the reasons why we left the big church, but I don't want anyone to think that it's because of a specific church we were in. In fact, the last church that we were a part of was a wonderful body of believers. We still have friends there, but it was a situation where we didn't both feel like it was our church home. And being married, we want unity. Wherever we go, we're going together. And so that was the issue there. So we don't want anyone to take it personally. It's more of what we saw going on in the world. But I'm going to let you speak to that. So when we originally stepped out of the church back in, is that 2017 maybe? I think was about the time we stepped out. We eventually started a small group at home. And what were some of the reasons why you were okay with that or looked forward to that? What was your thinking at that time for stepping out of the big church and having a church at home?
It was sort of a mix of thoughts. Part of the situation that initially started this line of thought was that the church that we were going to at that time had started to become more interested, I think, in cultural relevance than trying to find what was true. And that had been true, I think, for a long time, but as time progressed, it seemed like it had become more and more the norm than the exception. And at one point, I remember thinking, not only was this something that was purely about cultural relevance, but the people that we were going to for discussions with leadership were often like half my age. They were people where they would say things that were often very culturally relevant, and I've lived long enough to know that what they were saying is just not true. Not because they didn't have bad intent. I'm not trying to indicate anything other than just a lack of experience in that area. And, as a father and a husband, I feel a sense of responsibility for making sure that whatever our family is doing, we're moving in a positive direction for the entire family. And so, dipping into something where the primary focus was becoming cultural relevance, and the people who are supposed to be in charge were either sort of left or right, not politically, but like they were off center from where they really needed to be in terms of their thinking, because they hadn't really been tested yet in those areas, made me start reflecting on the idea that I needed to do something different. And while we did try to go to another church, like you had mentioned, it wasn't really working out as a fit. And I sort of took my role as a leader in our family, the responsibility of that leadership seriously, and started thinking that maybe I could cooperate with other families and other basically adults around our age to pursue the discovery of the truth without a conventional church model. And there were, I think, a lot of things that sort of disillusioned me to the original church model that we were in as well, because it wasn't just the cultural relevance that seemed to surface a lot of other things that just didn't seem right to me about the way that the church was going on. And so it was kind of a scenario that was ripe for pulling me out of that and then funneling me in a direction where I thought that I could handle all of that on my own, and sort of took for granted some of the things that were just sort of happening and in a sense were being provided by the church that we were in at the time, that then became fully my responsibility at the point that we went on our own.
So I know that when we first started our small group at home, at first our small group was not Hebrew roots. That wasn't even on the radar for our group. Now, if you watch my interview with R.L. Solberg and some of my other videos, I share that I started a Bible study with a few that were sort of leading that group, the Hebrew Roots direction. Earlier, we started in August 2019. That was when I started in that Bible study, around there, August, September. And we started our group in November, but really started meeting regularly that January of 2020, because it was the year of the pandemic. So I know that when I started this group, originally we were actually starting with some couples that were part of a Bible study I'd been with for years and years. They couldn't all come, but it was a small home group kind of church setting where we'd read the word and fellowship and have meals together. And in my mind, in that time, that group was temporary to me. It was until we got plugged into another church at the time. Now that changed, but when we started that group, I don't think I've ever asked you, was that something that you thought was a temporary till we found a church, or was that something you thought might be a replacement?
I'm not sure if I actually knew that. I knew for the very least it was temporary, but I could have seen it, I think, becoming a more permanent thing, but that would have required it to have gone really well. Mm-hmm. And
at first it did.
Yeah, at first it did. So it seemed like it could stick for a long period of time, but I don't know that I'd really lined out a full thought on that.
And what was your thought on starting the group? We had started with you and another a couple, and that the husband of that couple was the leader of the group with you. And at that time, what was your view at that time about elders? Because we had some friends reach out to us with concerns that there wasn't a pastor or elders or a board or council, deacons, overseers, that we weren't under a larger church group. And what was your mentality at that time about having that structure or not having that structure?
I think a lot of it really just came down to the fact that I was partially thinking from the mode of the idea that the elders in the church that we had started in were like half my age and often untested. Maybe they didn't, in many cases, I don't know if they had families. So there's a lot of areas where they couldn't even speak to the situations that we were going through as a family, which, I realized that an elder doesn't necessarily need to have lived every life to be able to speak to a lot of scenarios, but that's a fairly common one, to have a family that you have a responsibility for. So I didn't think that was really moving in the right direction. But if you take a look at a lot of the descriptions of elders, while I definitely didn't qualify in the age category, most of the other things that were listed as criteria, basically, it's a results orientation. Is what are the results? What are the fruits of what's been done through their leadership right now? Most of the rest of those,
You want to let that go?
it's probably a salesperson.
We'll let them ring the doorbell for this video. Go ahead.
Most of the rest of those, it seemed like I had. And so because I did have a lot of those, and we were seeing that in our family, the only one that seemed a little off was just that I think the elders they're typically looking for somebody who's 60s. I can't remember off the top of my head. And so, between that and the fact that some of the other family members, or not family members, but families that we were working with were even older than us.
Slightly.
Yeah, not by
within a decade.
Yeah, not by a wide margin, but it seemed like it was closer, at least, to what an elder should be than what we were coming from.
What was your desire for that group? What did you think it was? What did you want it to be? Because at first it was wonderful fellowship. What was it to you? What was your perspective on what that should be for our family?
I think it was a combination of things. In one, the church is supposed to be more of a community than what it was at the church that we had been attending. And it was very easy to walk into the church that we had used to attend and notice nobody, be noticed by nobody, basically be invisible, have no community, have no connection outside of the fact that you could say that you had gone. And that definitely was not a right fit. So there was one element. Another element is just taking a look at what you'd see in Acts about how the church operated, where they were often in people's homes. And in that case, a lot of times that was out of necessity, but
we saw an intimacy there in that setup of the church.
Yeah, and it was definitely a smaller group. I mean, you weren't typically seeing groups of thousands upon thousands of people in early churches, at least. And then the other one was definitely to move away more from cultural relevance and into the pursuit of the truth instead of the whatever the wind of the day was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So eventually, though, we saw a shift in our group. I know that the women had a Bible study, and outside of the church, our small group, I'll call it our small group, and things were discussed there among the women that were, at least for a while, much different than what was presented in our small group times. So when these topics came up that would be brought up by the women about the holy days, like feast days or abstaining from food, when we were bringing up those topics, what was your understanding of what was going on at that point?
Well, I don't recall whether this was something where it was actually presented this way originally, whether it actually literally was this way originally, or whether I just perceived it this way. But I know that when this started, my understanding was that basically there were some people that were digging into the Old Testament, largely because they hadn't really done it before, and were just looking at different things in it and saying, these are feasts and festivals. We can celebrate these too, just to participate as a way of trying to honor God in our own way. It's not a requirement. It's just something that we're free to do because we have the freedom to choose to do a good thing. Mm-hmm. That was my understanding of it. And so since it was something that I was operating from that perspective on, and it wasn't something that was a negative or a harm, I had no real issue with it.
Yeah, because, and I remember you saying this in the beginning, that we're seeking the word together, we're working these things out together, and we felt at that time that we would have accountability within, it wasn't a tiny group. I mean, our home was filled with up to 28 to 32 people, children included, but it wasn't like 4 people in a room. We had a pretty big, a sizable community, mm-hmm. but not as large as a church you would go to on a Sunday morning. And you have always been a person who's, you try to make good judgments, but you're not judgmental. And I remember you telling me that we were free to search out these matters and even free to do them. But you didn't know at that, as time went on, you didn't know that behind the scenes that the women were praying for our husbands, for your eyes to be opened. And eventually, we had some members come into the group that we knew were presenting these ideas. And I don't think at that time you knew how deep it went, mainly because you're not on social media, and that's where a lot of these posts would be made about the deeper beliefs of the Mosaic Law is what we're talking about, and having to keep those things, even if not for salvation, then for obedience. And so when do you remember seeing a shift in the group? And I do want to say that there was a member that you had some concerns about coming in, but I advocated for this person because this was such a beautiful, lovely person and kind and a wonderful person. But on top of that, I had already started moving down this belief system and was okay with those teachings. But you had a warning in you that said, we need to pause, we need to think about this, and were overruled by a vote. And so when did you start seeing a shift? Did you notice a shift in the teachings after that time, a change? Or did it still seem like it was just about freedom of choice at that time?
I don't know that I noticed a shift in it. If I were to notice something that I would call a shift, I would say there were 2 things that seemed like they changed a little bit. One is that the focus on discussion about Old Testament topics definitely started to increase, the frequency of that. Mm-hmm. That was a much more predominant thing. I have no issue with that. That's totally fine. And many churches don't look into the Old Testament at all. So I don't have any problem looking into it and talking about it more often. I think it's a good thing for people to do. But the shift was mostly, from my vantage point, just an increased discussion about that with a few people that were kind of going into certain odds and ends about aspects of it, whether it's feasts or festivals or something that they were studying themselves. I did also notice that the women in the group seemed like they were talking about these things a lot more often. But I didn't really make a huge note about that. A lot of these same women had been in Bible studies even recently, or actively were in Bible studies separately from that. So to me, it just kind of read like a continuation of that. Which, I mean, in retrospect, maybe it was that, and I just didn't know enough about what was going on in some of those Bible study discussions. But the I don't know that I read it as a shift from being free to do these things, free to look into these things, to honor God, to anything other than that until close to the end of our tenure with that group.
Because you didn't know.
I was left out of a lot of it, and I don't think I was left out, like, it wasn't malicious. I believe somebody told me that the focus was just out of respect for how busy I was, because I'm pretty busy, so I can easily believe that out of respect for my schedule and things like that, it seemed, I guess, in the minds of the people that were leaving me out as a disputable matter. But I'm just speculating. I mean, you could speak a lot more to what the thinking was behind that, but I do know that some of the things that were brought to my attention at the end of this process were very different. And it's a subtle shift. There was a subtle shift in thinking from being free to do things to being not free to not do them. And that, when I say it like that, it's really obvious, but the way that the thinking was going on at the time, not with me, but with the group, it was much more subtle than that. So it's a lot harder to recognize. And you can only really see it when somebody speaks unreservedly and kind of in an unrestrained way about those thoughts. And that seemed like it was only going on social media. I wasn't on social media, so I never saw it. Right. It wasn't towards the end where I started seeing some of those unreserved, just freewheeling expressions of what their thinking was, that I was realizing that their thinking and what I was thinking were not in alignment.
That was the time when you and I were trying to decide, what do we do here? Because we don't want to abandon people. These are people we love. We've been in a relationship for a long time, and I know a lot of people watching have friends or family members who are still there, and they've stepped out like we have, or they were never in it, and they're looking on how to keep relationship. And the hard part here was that we took a long time to try to figure out what to do, and you take a long time to make decisions because of what I explained. You want to make sure that you've calculated things from all sides or looked at things from all sides, because you don't want to prejudge or misjudge the situation before you make a decision. And so we did stay, and I had some concerns, and people say, just get out of there. Why did you stay? But we loved those people, and we did try to stay. What was your reason? If someone says, why didn't you just get your wife out of there? What was your reason? We weren't meeting a whole lot at that time, the group, but we stayed for 5 months almost, because I started coming out of this around December 23rd of 2021, and then we stayed through about April is when we exited, loose term. But why did you choose to keep our family there for a while?
I think I kept the family there for a variety of reasons. One, at the time, I was pretty sure that the entire problem was limited to 1 or 2 people. That was all that I had seen evidence of, at least at the time. So I didn't think that this was a broad problem. And I also thought that most of the other people in the group basically agreed with me in the way that I was thinking. So it was a bit of a surprise when I found out that that wasn't the case, that there was actual disagreement, and it was broader than just a handful of people that thought differently than I did. And I'm not one who's quick to make changes. I look at things, and most of the time I don't change things, because most of the time changes that are made frequently and quickly are changes made to get away from something. And if I haven't given enough time to dedicate myself to whatever that is in that situation, to feel that it's not a situation that's going to improve or change, then I look at myself as somebody who's just too prone to bail out. So I try to stick through it enough to make sure that not only do I have the situation and my understanding of it correctly, but also make sure that I'm not rushing to judgment. Right. And so I thought it was a situation that we could just address and would probably improve. That's not what actually happened. But I guess it's really a sense of responsibility to make sure that I'm not jumping to conclusions, that I'm not making rash decisions, that I'm taking the seriousness of my responsibility to my family and my friends with the seriousness it deserves, and just try to be responsible.
Not just sever relationships.
Yeah, I didn't want to do any of that. Right. And honestly, I didn't think that would happen at the time.
And so it was it was subtle. The introduction to it was subtle through scriptures, through points, trying to just help everyone understand and sort of pull the group that direction. There was a lot of prayer among the women for our husbands that their eyes would be opened. And then it went to the point where I know that we had a woman teaching our group festivals and things and teaching the men and women. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and I would say, a lot of the time when that was presented, the way that I was hearing it was that this is a person who's actually studied this more than I've studied it. I've never seen fit to study it because I'm not a Hebrew. I'm not a practicing member of the Jewish faith today. So I hadn't really looked into a lot of those things. And so it seemed like something that if somebody in the group knew more about that than I knew about it, that I should listen to what they'd learned about it. And that's when that came up, that's kind of where my frame of mind was. Again, it wasn't really something where somebody was outright saying, well, you must do these things in our group, at least not inside the group. They were saying that really in more private conversation or on social media. So unless you just happen to be in that private conversation or in social media, you'd never have known that, or picked up on the subtleties. And I mean, in retrospect, some of those subtleties are more clear to me, but they weren't at the time.
I'm going to segue back to the social media stuff at the end when I presented some things to you. But I wanted to go back to our relationship specifically because I know there are some that are going through a hard time in their marriage and how you dealt with me on some of those things. Just to let everyone know, Lance is he is a non-judgmental person. He doesn't want to jump the gun. He wants to get to know someone and their character and all the information he can possibly have before coming to a conclusion on something. And so even in our marriage, it works out that way where he's just, because you said we just have a common courtesy for one another in our marriage. And so we don't jump the gun even to judge one another. But there were a few times where you saw some changes in me and set a boundary on me for some of those things. But at first, I just wanted to ask you, because you said at some point in this walk where I was walking in the Torah lifestyle, that there were some positive changes in me, and I wanted to speak to the positive first. Do you remember some of those things that you said were positive things that came out of that?
Yeah, at the time, there was definitely a turn in you where you were focused. I want to say focused more on the family, but that's not quite right. It was more focused on family cohesion, I think. And so I saw the way that you were interacting with our sons change. You were really working on your relationship with them, and it was in a way where you weren't negating the authority you have as their mother, but you were also sort of tapering back unnecessary areas that might have caused some contention in the relationship. And I noticed a few of the same kinds of things with respect to me. It was just, like I said, it's like a focus on family cohesion. That improved when you started getting into this, which is another reason that I didn't have reason to think that it was different than how I perceived it, is that the initial fruits that I was seeing coming out of it were good things.
Mm-hmm. And I think that I wouldn't chalk that up to the Hebrew Roots movement whatsoever, but I would say that some positive things about that movement is that you're in the Word a lot, and there is a reverence for God. And we get distracted with life and family, and even though we're in the Word of God, or we have a fellowship, and we're trying to love our neighbors and love our families, we can get distracted. And it really did bring my heart back to God in a reverent way that I had lost through the distractions of life. Not that I had lost my relationship with God, but abiding in Him more fully, and letting some of those things go, even with our children, being like, hold on, we need to bring this back. Some of these things don't matter. What matters is the love of Christ and what we're showing to one another in the home. And that was the fire grew. Like there was more, wood on the fire in that way, because I was in the Word more and having more of that reverence. But over time, we started having an issue with you getting coffee on Sabbath. Do you remember anything about that?
Oh yeah, I mean, I know you had told our sons that they shouldn't go and order certain things on Sabbath. Like one of them would want a pizza, and you'd dissuade them from eating pizza on the Sabbath because somebody had to cook it. And in my case, I'm somebody who's prone to getting a coffee every day, and so I would go and get a coffee on Saturday, and you at the time were not particularly happy with me about that. And so I recall you had confronted me about my willingness to go get coffee on Saturday. And I think on some level also to my willingness to buy food for our sons on Saturday, especially the one that wanted pizza. He always wanted pizza whenever he wasn't supposed to want pizza.
And pepperoni pizza,
Yeah.
which that threw a whole other wrench in.
But the thinking that I had at the time is that, well, several different lines of thought. One is I wasn't raised to be a Hebrew. I'm not somebody who was raised in the Jewish faith. And so perceptions of what constitutes Sabbath in the Christian faith are also a little different just generally. But another thing that I had some disagreements with were the strict definitions of work. I wasn't working. I was buying a coffee. I'm feeding myself. I guess if I were to go and take a look at Old Testament interpretations of that, in theory, I should have bought the coffee the night before. But again, I don't know. I never really looked at that as a thing, because it's like I'm going to actually literally have to work harder to make this coffee for myself this morning and to go across the street and buy it.
And I tried to get you to make your own coffee. I'm like, we have 3 coffee pots. And we laugh now, thank goodness, because we have a good relationship and we feel that humor is very healing. But in the moment, when I'm glaring at you and I'm going and I'm crying because you're leading our children to buy things on Sabbath, there weren't some good feelings there. And I remember you telling me, and I know you said you'd only have a vague recollection of this, but it got to a point where like the coldness, like the coffee kind of glares, and purchasing things on Sabbath, and some of these other things, how I would speak about what I called the American church, or the mainstream church. I remember one evening we were having a heated discussion based on some of these things, and I don't even remember the details of what we were talking about, but it led to you saying to me that I had such a contempt for the American church, and whenever I am speaking badly about the American church, you said that I was judging. You're like, you're judging everybody in this house. And that's all I remember you saying. But you did set a firm boundary on me because I was showing contempt for your freedom. I was showing contempt for the freedom of our children to go get a pizza or what they ate. And I definitely did not have a loving heart toward others who weren't living the way I was living.
Yeah, I mean that was probably those areas were definitely the deepest areas of disagreement that we had during that time, and I obviously contempt for the family. This was later on the process because in the beginning it was family cohesion, but over time, a lot of this really did morph, and as it began to morph and I started noticing the contempt for the family, I definitely my resistance to what you were asking me to do in that area increased. But just as far as working on the Sabbath, specifically going and getting a coffee or something like that, my definition of work was just very different. I spend so much time working, I feel like I've got a fairly good sense of what work is, and so doing not that in a way that requires me to just be able to rest, I know what that is for myself, and so I just had some disagreements about what constituted work. There was a variety of different things that kind of made me think differently. But again, I was also at that time still operating from a perspective that anything that we were choosing to do was chosen to do voluntarily in addition to. I was not operating from the framework that if I wasn't doing those things, that I was doing something wrong.
Right.
At that time.
And I was.
And I didn't know.
Obviously I was, because it would come out of my mouth. What I would say out of my mouth would be, I'm doing these things because I love God. But in my actions, my contempt and the kind of pointing fingers and the glare stares and the upset and the very grieving in my heart that you went to get a coffee or that we were in discord on raising our children in a different way, that says something very different. That says that that the reason I'm saying it's for is not actually the reason I'm saying.
Yeah, that's towards the end of that process. This is where I think a lot of that conflict started to arise, is I started to realize a little bit more around the time that conflict was happening, what became much more obvious as I started to see what some of the others were saying on social media. But it had been something that was always expressed as something, I'm going to do this because I love God, and because I love God, I'm going to do all these things to show him that I love him and express that I love him more. I have no issue with any of that. The problem was when it looked outward to other people. Those that weren't doing that were perceived as loving God less. And then a bunch of different follow-on would come from that. And that's where I started having a lot of issue, because that's where this has moved from something you're free to do to express your love for God more, to something that you're not free to do because it's law. And I had never signed up for another list of rules as a Christian, the idea is that Gentiles are not subject to the Hebrew law in the first place. I'm definitely not somebody that is genetically Hebrew in even a small part, as far as I know. I haven't done a genetic test. So, I consider myself to be a Gentile from that understanding, and I never thought of myself as somebody who was bound by that law in the first place.